And joining us now on the debate, Deputy Grand Chief Mike Metatawabin from the Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Pamela Palmater from the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University, Ron Jamieson from the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Randall Phillips from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and Douglas Sanderson from the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. And a reminder, this is a Your Agenda Thursday broadcast where you're part of the discussion. You can reach us on Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. Please jump in, join the debate. We'll put some of your comments on the screen throughout the course of tonight's broadcast. Also, as he does every Thursday, our fifth column blogger Mike Miner is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. That's on the homepage at tvo.org/theagenda, so you can log on there, join your fellow viewers in that way too. Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us this evening for this discussion. You heard what the minister had to say. I want to read one excerpt from the report of the Ipperwash Inquiry to get us started here. Here's Judge Sidney Linden. The complexity and importance of Aboriginal issues has outgrown the institutional arrangements dedicated to them within the provincial government. I have concluded, therefore, that the provincial government should create a Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs with a clear mandate and authority, with its own minister, with a seat at the cabinet table, and deputy minister, and its own budget. Creating this ministry would go a long way towards ensuring that Aboriginal issues receive the priority and focus they deserve, and it would also herald a commitment by the province to a new, constructive relationship with Aboriginal peoples. Okay, Douglas, that's the recommendation. You heard the minister's response to whether or not the government was adhering to that recommendation. What's your view?
Well, I mean, I think the key point from Justice Linden's recommendation there involves the seat at the table. And that is crucial, because I think what people don't understand about the structure of the government of Ontario is that the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs is a corporate ministry. They have their hands in the business of other ministries, but they can't make other ministries do things. So for example, if you want to tackle issues about, say, suicide in the North, you need to work with the Minister of Health, you need to work with the Minister of Social Services, and none of those ministers will act without authorization from the Premier, without direction from above. And to get those interests represented around the cabinet table, you need a full-time and engaged minister. It's not enough at the end of the day to have someone be doing this part-time. Now, I like Minister Bentley. He's been a great Attorney General. He's a great minister before that. And he has gone out and done a lot of work over the past month, but it's not a pace that he can really sustain. The fact is that to represent First Nations interests, he needs to get out and meet with the leadership on a regular basis. The First Nations in the province have complex political machines that represent their people, but they need someone to talk to, and that has to be a minister.
Let me jump in here for 1 second, because I think we might have screwed up the introduction here, and I want to make sure everybody, I saw you guys looking at each other, and I didn't see the camera when it happened. So let's just do this. Let's just, for the record, one more time. The man in the middle of that three-shot right now is Ron Jamieson. Hello, Ron, National Co-Chairman of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business.
Thank you, Steve.
Lovely. Okay, because I saw you making eyes at me before, and I couldn't figure out why, because I didn't see the shot.
Not a problem.
Okay, and Randall Phillips, who's over there in the red shirt, is the Grand Chief of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians.
Yes.
Are we all straight now?
We are.
Perfect. Okay.
And he's a better chief than I am.
I'm going to Pamela now, because I want her reaction to what the minister had to say on whether or not this Ontario government is keeping faith with this recommendation.
I completely agree with Professor Sanderson. I mean, look, you can spin it however you want, but the fact of the matter is you can't argue with logistics. There's 2 times the amount of work, the Aboriginal portfolio is growing, and now you're going to give it to one person. More than that, though, working with Aboriginal peoples is first and foremost about the relationship. In June 2007, after the Ipperwash Inquiry, the Premier said, "This standalone ministry is our significant and symbolic commitment to a new relationship." So if creating a standalone ministry was that significant commitment, what does revoking it say to Aboriginal people?
Well, Ron, let me put this to you. There is an argument to be made that as Attorney General, he's one of the highest ranking cabinet ministers in the government. And as a result, he has what you might call added heft at the cabinet table that perhaps a standalone minister might not have. And he also said he's a dedicated minister.
I have no doubt of that, Steve, and I don't question his dedication to the job. But, you know, the government, I think, missed an opportunity. You know, as Pam alluded to, to work with Aboriginal people, it's about a relationship. We've had minister after minister in a very short period of time. So we missed an opportunity for a dedicated minister to build an ongoing positive relationship. Brad Dogood, the former minister, who's now over at Energy and Infrastructure, I've got a lot of time and respect for him because he was dedicated to it. He was sincerely interested in it and
now he's
demonstrated that. And now he's gone. It's too soon to say whether Minister Bentley is going to do a good job or a bad job, but I'm going to be watching very carefully on the results. That's how I'm going to judge it. So.
Okay. Randall, what do you say?
I think I got to concur with the comments that are made so far. I do know Minister Bentley as well, and I think that he's an honorable gentleman.
Is there a conflict between his responsibilities
Oh,
as
I
AG?
think definitely.
There is?
I think definitely.
How so?
How so is that I think that for years and years we've been trying to push our Aboriginal agenda, trying to push these issues forward, trying to have that understanding in terms of where our rights come from, and explain that to the Canadian public. Now what we've got here is, as you indicated earlier, now we've got somebody who is in place to defend those rights from Ontario. How can that not be a conflict of interest? I take Mr. Bentley personal aside, but given his role here as both ministers, I think that there's an inherent conflict with respect to this. When we first started this, the first minister was Natural Resources, First Nations, and that ministry had conflict after conflict after conflict. I don't see any difference here with respect to these types of things. Now we're starting to talk about legal issues. Now we're starting to get into treaty rights. Now we're starting to get into Aboriginal rights. Who's best to defend the government of Ontario in those regards? Minister, the Attorney General.
Attorney General. Mike, is it a problem that he has both hats on?
Oh yeah, it's going to be. It's not going to be an easy process moving forward. You can't have both portfolios. You have to represent the interests of the First Nations. I just wanted to point out too that just Treaty 9 itself, that treaty was signed with directly by Ontario.
You better explain what that is, Treaty 9.
Treaty 9 is our territory in Northern Ontario, and that's when, back in 1905, a treaty was entered into with at the time it was said it was with Canada, but we also have proven that it was Ontario who played a major role in signing that treaty. So we have a direct relation, and with that in mind, we need to have a standalone ministry that we can deal with the various issues.
Well,
that we
he
deal
says you still have a standalone ministry. You just don't have a standalone minister.
Well, you know, you still, like, you have to have a minister to deal with these issues.
Well, you do.
You can't, it won't work.
Pamela, he says you do have a minister prepared to tackle these issues. He's
Yes.
just not, that's just not his only job, that's all.
And he doesn't stand alone. However, I'm not looking forward to the day when he's standing in Parliament saying, okay, 1 minute. Yes, we're going to have to arrest the protesters at this place, but just a minute. But we're working on a new positive relationship. I don't see those two things being compatible.
Douglas, let me put this to you, because you were an advisor before it was the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. The Ontario government dealt with Aboriginal Affairs, and you were an advisor to them.
That's true, sir.
And this is going back how many years now?
4 or 5.
4 or 5 years. How effective, okay, there was no ministry, then there was a ministry. How much better is it to have a ministry to implement government policy than it was in the days when you were there?
Well, the primary difference between a ministry and what existed when I was there, which was the Ontario Native Affairs Secretariat, is that the secretariats are small. And so this is a bulked up version. It's got more staff. And on the civil service side, the key difference is that the ministry has its own deputy minister. So the deputy minister is then able to coordinate with other deputies and other ministries.
So that's a big deal.
That's a big deal. And it is true that the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs is a small ministry. So if in the Premier's infinite wisdom, it must be combined with another ministry. The right ministry is Intergovernmental Affairs, which sends the right message to First Nations and says, we think of you not as stakeholders, but as another order of government. And if you want to do it right, if you want to get the structure right, and if you get the structure right, you can get the right results, that portfolio should be held by the Premier himself. because then ministers get direction from the Premier. They're all able to pull together. They
But
all row
everybody
in the
wants
same
that,
direction.
Douglas. Everybody wants the Premier to be their minister. I remember when he had research and innovation, and that community thought, isn't this great, we've got the Premier. But then the Premier passed it off to somebody else, and then it's not so great anymore.
Well, they still have time left in the mandate. There's a good amount of time, and they fumbled the ball here, but it's not too late to do the right thing. And if the Premier or staff are listening, I highly recommend you treat First Nations people not as stakeholders who need a minister, but as another order of government. That sends the right message, and by combining with intergovernmental affairs, you send that message.
Ron, that's a controversial message to send, though. There are lots of people in this province who simply don't see this as a nation-to-nation relationship.
Well, it truly is, though, Steve. It truly is. And, you know, the one thing the minister said earlier, which was absolutely true, is that, you know, the First Nation people, at least, and there are other Aboriginal groups in Ontario, for sure, but for First Nation people, their relationship is with the federal government. And he mentioned about difficulty in getting the federal government involved. They have to, meaning the federal government, has to step up and accept their responsibility. And that's part of the problem in Caledonia. And I want to talk about Caledonia, Steve.
Hold off on it, because I'm going to get there. I'm going to
Okay.
get there. I want to talk about the youth
All right.
suicide first, because I think this is such an urgent and shocking issue. I'm going to start by reading an excerpt that was in the Toronto Star last month, and then, Mike, I want to start with you, Deputy Chief Mike. Here we go from the Star. The loss of a full-time Aboriginal Affairs Minister in Ontario is, quote, a step backwards and flies in the face of findings of the Ipperwash Inquiry, First Nations leaders warn. Faced with high unemployment, a youth suicide crisis in remote northern areas, and general frustration among First Nations people regarding land development, now is not the time to scale back gains made with Brad Dogood as the standalone minister, so said Grand Chief Stan Beardy. The Premier doesn't seem to see Aboriginal issues as worthy of a standalone minister, he added. This is backwards for us and very disappointing. Deputy Chief Mike, I want to raise this issue in relation to the appalling statistics that we did present earlier in the program to the minister. You represent an area where 13 young people have taken their life, 80 have attempted to, all teenagers, all by hanging themselves. This is the James Bay Basin, and I want you, if you can, to describe how those appalling statistics affect the greater community that you represent.
Well, it's something very shocking that when it happens, it totally catches you like off guard, and it really has an impact on the community. And at the same time, as communities, we need to look at that as well. We need to ask ourselves, something happened here, and what was that? What did it mean for the entire community?
Do you know
And-
why it happens?
Well, I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and he said that suicide is a symptom
Of,
of something deeper within the community or within families.
is it economic, is it cultural, is it, what is it? Help us understand.
Well, we have a wide history, a history faced with needing to adapt to change, constant change happening to the communities. From once thriving families living off the lands and territories, hunting and trapping, to being forced to live within the communities, like being corralled onto the reserves, and then hanging up the skills in like the traditional pursuits that they once enjoyed. You don't have that on reserve.
Pamela, I'd like to go to you next. Can you help us understand? There are some Aboriginal communities where suicide is just not a factor. And then there are others, like the Deputy Chiefs here, where it's off the charts and scary. What are the variables that make one different from another?
Well, this is nothing new, first of all. I mean, even RCAP identified the high suicide rates in First Nations communities as something that needed to be addressed. They even had a 3-part plan for all governments to look at and to work with First Nations to deal with it. They had the same kind of findings as more recent studies. For example, they say that communities who have been affected by cultural stress. So, for example, they're flown out of their communities for long-term hospitalizations. They're flown out of their communities for boarding schools. Their belief systems have been challenged. Things like that causes a severe amount of cultural stress, and in remote communities, they don't have the resources by which to deal with it. So,
So suicide becomes an option.
Well, and the part of the problem is, the reason why you see epidemics is because if you see one person take their life, then youth, especially, consider that now an option, especially if over a long period of time, not just a few years, but decades and decades and decades of no change, no help, no resources. And one of the biggest factors is actually whether the community is moving forward with self-government, with cultural revitalization, and pursuing land claims. The communities that address those three factors have far lower rates of suicide than other communities.
Randall Phillips, you wanted to say.
Well, yes, I just wanted to say that, first of all, it's a tragic issue. There's no doubt about it. But it's not isolated with respect to some of the communities that you've identified. Just recently in our territory, there was another youth suicide too as well. So just simply because they're not publicized as such, it doesn't mean that it's isolated in certain areas. What part of the problem is, and I think Pam started to identify it, is that there's quite an amount of challenge within a lot of First Nations communities when we talk about social issues, and that has an impact in terms of how you view yourself, how you view others, how you deal with these other kinds of things. When we talked about this other difference with respect to how these communities are, I put it down to this, and that's this idea of hope. Each one of us have this idea of hope, and when that's taken away from you, what options do you have? Then you look at other options with respect to perhaps even suicide, to these types of things. That's what we're looking at. Economic development is one way in terms of trying to change that, but it's not going to change overnight. What we have now is we have individuals, and unfortunately we've got young individuals that haven't had an opportunity to really understand what it is to live in the world. And what they see is despair, and what they see is challenge, what they see is conflict, what they see is all these things. That's why we need a good relationship. And when we get back to this notion of, is the Ontario government on the right path in terms of strengthening that relationship and moving on those wider issues, that's where we can start to look forward and put some hope back in our kids. And then we can start to change these things. We need to have some investment in our kids. We need to have some investment in our future, and we need to have a government to understand it, and we need to have the people of Ontario to understand it too.
Douglas, let me put this to you. Is there something about the Aboriginal way of life in very remote communities in this province that is just simply not consistent with the 21st century anymore? And this contributes to suicide rates.
No.
Is that fair to say?
No,
Not fair to say.
I don't think it is. I think there's often this tendency to think of First Nations people living in their communities and choosing to live in ways that are like the ways of their traditional ancestors, that somehow that makes them backwards. But it doesn't. They are, in fact, our contemporaries. We can call them on the telephone and speak to them, and they will speak at us. And they are every bit as modern as we are here in this television studio. And there's something deeply racist, in fact, about this idea that choosing to live a traditional life is somehow to live a backwards life. I mean, we accept all kinds of people
Not
living
backwards,
all
but
kinds.
hang on, I got to challenge this a bit, because there are lots of communities in this, grand experiment we call Canada that are living very traditional lives. They are living according to, you go into the northwest part of this city and you see Orthodox Jews who are living the same way as people in Poland did in the 16th century. The suicide rates are not there.
Exactly right.
So why are they there in Aboriginal communities?
Well, I think if, as my colleagues around the table have said, there's poverty and there's despair, and there are communities where there is very little hope, where slowly their choices are being taken from them as their waters become polluted, as the migration patterns of game are disrupted, their choices about how they want to live are being taken away from them. And that leaves people in a situation with very little hope. And that is on top of a legacy of residential schools, which destroyed the intergenerational fabric of our communities, that because of the residential schools, young women never learned to become mothers and to mother their children. Men. I'm
going to jump in because I don't want the clock
brothers.
to get away from us, and I can always tell who the professors are on the programs because they think we've got 90 minutes for a lecture and we've got 40 minutes for a debate. Mike, you wanted to say, and then I want to bring up Caledonia as I promised I would for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue along the lines of the First Nations communities, remote locations. They've been constantly facing or adapting to change. There's always something that's happening. The residential school, for instance, that's something that's just a part of our history that we've survived. And then on the coastal community side, we've had to deal with the radar sites, the establishment of radar sites, and again, another intrusion of a group of people coming onto the communities. That has had an impact. So there's been constant struggle, adapting to change, and also putting up with a lot of things that have been going on. Communities haven't had time to settle down to kind of take a deep breath and kind of look around and figure out where we're at.
Right.
Things are moving so fast, moving at a constant rate. For me, what I hope in the future is that people, the community, be given an opportunity to be a part of any development that's happening, or be a part of the infrastructure as you develop the communities, and families to take part in educating and supporting their children as we move forward.
Well, just before I get to Caledonia, then, do you really think the private sector is a huge player in the solution to the problem we've just been talking about here?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely.
They can be?
Absolutely, Steve. And you know,
Have
going
they
back to what
indicated a
Randy
willingness
said-
to do that?
Oh yeah, and more today. And you know, the organization I'm representing here tonight, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, that is their mandate, to bring together the broader Canadian corporate sector together with Aboriginal people in this province and elsewhere in Canada for their mutual benefit. And corporations understand that that is good for them, and it's good for their partners, the Aboriginal people. And if you do that right, Steve, over time, I mean, the situation that you alluded to, the suicide, it is tragic. And there's, tonight, sitting at this table, we can't solve that. Mm-hmm. But, you know, over the next generation, I wish it were sooner, but over the next generation, a combination of education and economic development will go a long way to solving this problem.
Let me follow this up with Randall here, because if I'm hearing you correctly, there's a level of mistrust between Aboriginal nations and the provincial government. There's a level of mistrust between Aboriginal nations and the federal government. But you think corporate Canada is going to come riding in on a white horse and help solve this problem?
I certainly don't think they're going to come riding in a white horse. But what I wanted to point out was that there's a difference now that happened between 10, 15 years ago. And that's corporate Canada understands that, first of all, they got a social and moral responsibility to do so. And secondly, they're bypassing government rules and regulations that have stifled growth in First Nations communities forever. And I think now that since the government has taken a step back, or whether they've been pushed, forced, however, and businesses are coming up and saying, okay, let's start to do with this, because it's in our best interest for both of us to move forward. Since business and First Nations communities have started direct dialogue, we've seen some significant changes. And so it's not a white horse that they're drawing in, but they're recognizing that if a business is going to grow in Canada, that they have to include First Nations people, they have to include Aboriginal populations to make that happen. Government has refused that, and government has had laws and regulations and policies that have stifled that kind of growth. So now we're seeing a change, and now we're seeing some impact.
Do you think,
that.
Pamela, that Aboriginal nations can get rich off corporate Canada?
Well, I'd hate to think that the solution to social ills like suicide can all be boiled down to economic development. I don't think that's what anyone is saying here. But oftentimes, community members complain that the focus is on economic development. But there's other issues that come before that. How can you have a multi-billion-dollar project in a community if the community is struggling with capacity, with lack of education, with the day-to-day poverty issues, with tuberculosis, you know, flying out of your community every time you need a program or service? So self-government and strong governments and strong communities seems to me would be almost a prerequisite to inviting economic development, major economic development initiatives inside.
Okay, now I'm going to fulfill my promise to Ron, because we're going to talk Caledonia.
Good.
But you're not going to like what I'm going to read for starters here, Ron. Here we go. This is from the National Post. Back in November of 2009, and then you get the first comment on this, okay, Ron?
Yeah.
Here we go. In the years since the mayhem began, the Ontario Provincial Police has made no secret that its officers weren't about to aggravate the situation by provoking the natives. In instance after instance, Caledonians complained that police stood by and watched natives violate the law. People came to believe that while they remained subject to normal legal expectations, the natives could get away with almost anything without fear of police interference. Why? The OPP were handcuffed by the, quote, policy implications of negotiation and reconciliation with natives, so said the Crown lawyer in the case. Policy implications. In other words, the politics of the situation. The effect of earlier confrontations with natives, particularly at Ipperwash and Oka, was to terrify Ontario's government into a state of near paralysis.
Gee,
Comment, sir.
Did National Post write that? I'm shocked.
You're shocked, I know, I know.
But listen, let me tell you that I'm not a politician. I'm not a legal expert, but I can tell you this: more than 25 years ago, I sat on the Six Nation Council as an elected member for my district. We talked about land claims then, Steve. Not this specific claim, but many, many claims. And my father before me talked about land claims, as did his father. There has been zero movement at Caledonia.
Why not?
There's been zero movement on these claims for that period of time. So what you've got, Steve, is a great deal of frustration.
No, we get that, but why no progress? Why no progress after 200 years?
I don't know. You're asking the wrong person. Ask the federal government why there's no progress. I've asked them. Many others have asked them. And the frustration in the younger members of our community is such that they say, well, you old guys been talking and talking and talking. We'll show you how to get some action. And they do. And what annoys me about this article is this thing that's illegal, illegal behavior. The land was taken, Steve. I think that's illegal behavior the last time I checked. But nobody brings that up. They talk about the natives' illegal behavior. But nobody talks about stealing the land.
Well, it really does depend when you start the clock on this story, doesn't
Well,
it?
apparently.
Yeah.
Apparently, yeah.
Randall Phillips, let me go to you on this. There have been, the suggestion is there's two levels of justice, two standards of justice that have been at play. And yes, the Aboriginal communities have their 200-year-old land claim, and then you have people in the town of Caledonia who think, you know what, if we did this, we'd be hauled off to jail. How do you find a resolution with two such disparate points of view on this?
Well, first of all, I agree that there's been two tiers of justice here in this country for many years. Unfortunately, First Nations and Aboriginal people have been on the lower end of that. And that's what we talked about in terms of equality within this country. Ron is absolutely right. Land claims issues are not brand new, and they certainly won't be resolved by this. But that's exactly why the ministry was put in place, was to deal with land claims.
But didn't the province help by buying up that land?
Well, that's one issue. Let me take this to another step.
Well, did they or didn't they? Did that not help?
Has it been returned back to Purple and Six Nations?
No.
Let's talk about Oka. Has that been resolved yet? No. So the federal government or the provincial government purchasing land does not resolve the issue. Why? Let's talk about this fundamental issue called the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. How come Canada seems to be the only country that does not want to see that declaration be put in place? Why? Because it's inherently conflictual against Canadian government's position with respect to First Nations rights, First Nations entitlement, and First Nations land entitlements. This is where this stems from. The Constitution of this country recognizes that. So let's talk about 200 years of these kinds of things.
Okay, Pamela, you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's not that the views are necessarily so incompatible, it's a lack of education. The public just doesn't understand the basic concept that the governments, the private sector have all benefited from taking First Nations lands and resources, not just for a few decades, but for many, many centuries. So first and foremost, that's important. When you're looking at land claims in whole, you're also looking at two different worldviews. Six Nations, I presume, is looking about preserving their nation, their identity, their culture for future generations, and not just their children or grandchildren, but many generations into the future. Elected politicians tend to look at the here and now. What's going to piss off our constituency? Will I get elected? Can we appease them in the immediate? So that's when they start bringing out the checkbooks. Well, here, let's just try to compensate you, give you the that liquid check where money in, money out. But then you don't have any land, you don't have any resources, you don't have that necessary base for economic development. All of those things that are going to not only protect the community, but help them move forward in a more holistic way. And those kinds of fundamental principles seem to be missing from the discussion.
Douglas, what's the resolution to Caledonia that's out there just waiting to be had?
Treaty implementation.
I don't know if I can do it quickly enough. Well, I mean,
long is the show?
2 words.
I think we have a few minutes. It's clearly what has to happen is the federal government has to be involved. It was the federal government that made promises to the Six Nations originally regarding the size of the land that they would be given. They've not lived up to that, and there is a problem now in Caledonia. There is 2 sets of laws in order, so that there are the constitutionally protected treaty rights of the people of 6 nations, and they are coming into conflict now with other laws around, for example, trespass in Caledonia. And I want to say that I think in some ways Caledonia is something that the province of Ontario has actually managed to kind of get right, in that they have managed to keep the peace on the ground and to try and compensate landowners and businesses, and to not direct the OPP to take sides while the matter is being sorted out politically, which is the right place for it to be sorted out. But we need the federal government on board, and it's not as though they don't have a member of parliament who lives in Caledonia and who drives the Caledonia bypass every day.
Who's that a reference to?
Who is the Conservative member there? I'm sorry.
Diane Finley?
Yes, thank you so much.
Cabinet
yeah.
Minister.
Yes.
Okay. I want to pull an audible here, right out of left field. Got just a couple of minutes left in the program, and Pamela, I'll start with you. Opening ceremonies, Vancouver Olympics.
Wow.
The portrayal to the world of respect shown by the Canadian government towards Aboriginal peoples, the presentation of a harmonious relationship between Canada and its Aboriginal leaders. I was out there for, I don't know how many people watch it, 1 billion people to see? Did we do good there, or was that just all showbiz?
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Why?
I'm of mixed feelings with regards to that. It's great that you have Native people out in their regalia, dancing and sharing their traditions. And don't get me wrong, the economic development that came out of that was good for those First Nations.
But?
At the same time, as most of us sitting around here can say, Aboriginal people aren't just about dancing around in regalia. We're not just about looking wistfully at the past and saying, oh, wasn't that great when they were all harmonious and they had these little dances. It covers up the real issues. The fact that we're one of the only countries that haven't signed the UN Declaration. The fact that there's thousands of First Nations people living in poverty in BC who don't have homes, who are suffering high suicide rates, and we're celebrating a sporting event instead of dealing with those issues.
Ron, your view on that?
No, I completely agree with Pam. I mean, Squamish Nation, Lillooet First Nation their communities have benefited greatly from having the games in their territory. And I say good for them. But, there's a lot more to the issue than, as Pam rightly says, a display of cultural activity,
Randall?
which was nice.
What do you think?
Exactly.
Did you see it?
I think First Nations should have a part in terms of welcoming the world to this land. It is our land, so that's without question that we should be part of it. Is there pageantry, too much pageantry involved? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Our job here is to make sure that the pageantry doesn't extend past this.
Douglas, I got 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, I just agree with everything that's been said here already, and I have, having only witnessed them on television, my mom said, I bet they looked better in person.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight for a discussion about some very troubling issues, and but a necessary discussion that we had to have. Randall Phillips, Grand Chief of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Nations. Pam Palmater, Ryerson University. Good of you to be here with us tonight. On the other side of the table, Mike Metatawabin, Deputy Grand Chief, Nishnawbe Aski Nation. Ron Jamieson, National Co-Chair of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. And Douglas Sanderson, University of Toronto Law School. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.